Hey, it's Brandon Laws, and you're listening to Transform Your Workplace, a podcast that helps leaders build healthier, more human workplaces through fresh ideas and real conversations. This episode is brought to you by Xenium HR. If managing HR and payroll feels like a second full-time job, Xenium's complete HR plus payroll solution brings everything under one roof. Expert HR guidance, reliable payroll processing, compliance support, and modern technology that just works. With Xenium as your partner, you can focus on growing your people and your business while knowing your HR foundation is solid. All right, today I'm talking with Melissa Swift, the author of Work Here Now, Think Like a Human, and Build a Powerhouse Workplace. Melissa has a sharp eye for what's gone sideways in modern work and how leaders can set it right. Today we'll explore why so many workplaces feel overloaded and disconnected, how technology sometimes adds friction instead of removing it, and what leaders can do to make work safer, smarter, and a lot more human. By the end of this conversation, you'll walk away with ideas to reduce burnout, rethink productivity, and use technology in ways that truly serve your people. All right, let's jump into my conversation with Melissa Swift. Melissa, it is such a pleasure to have you on Transform Your Workplace. Thanks for coming on the show.
I am excited to be here. I mean, look, if there was ever a podcast I would want to be on, this topic is it. So I'm pretty pumped.
I so appreciate it. We're going to talk about your book. I think you wrote it a few years ago. Work Here Now, Think Like a Human, and Build a Powerhouse Workplace. And, you write that the everyday experience at work, you quote, is going wrong in three key ways. It's dangerous, it's boring, and it's frustrating and confusing. Like, why do you believe that, for one? And then if you were to speak to leaders about fixing one of those issues first, what would it be and why?
It's interesting. My fundamental belief is that, what is it they say? History doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes. I think we're going through right now a period almost tantamount to the early industrial revolution, where we've had so much technological change in the way that our work is done and enabled that, we're at a moment where stuff just doesn't work so great. Think about the early industrial revolution, that your factories would catch fire because there was sawdust all over the floor, and, machines would lop people's arms off, regularly. Just silly stuff. I think we're in a silly stuff era again. And so that's why I would focus first, if I were a leader, on the frustrating and the boring. Don't ignore them. Because when, people are constantly going, well, it's work, it's not supposed to be a party. And what they don't realize is that if we solve for some of the boredom and the frustration, you would increase productivity. Your shareholders don't want people sitting around in annoying meetings either. That doesn't help the bottom line either. But I think the first thing we've got to focus on is dangerous, because we're doing strange things to our brain with work these days, and it's less palpable because it's not the Industrial Revolution. It's not like physically endangering myself by having to, assemble 7,500 widgets in a day, right? We're not there. Although we are getting there again with things like warehouse work, right? Where we are actually physically overtaxing people in ways that are a little spooky and not good. But a lot of what we're doing is we're just overloading people's brains in a way that is dangerous. And you can say, well, that's fine. People need to just grind it out in a hustle. But when you get to the point where, let's say, for instance, senior executives are so loaded down by tasks that they can't make sensible decisions, again, forget about caring about them as human beings, which you should. Your shareholders don't want your CEO to make a bad business decision because they haven't slept properly in 3 days. It's kind of basics. So it's like Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Let's solve for dangerous to our health first, and then we can move on to the other stuff.
You wrote this book a couple of years ago, and I'm curious, in that time, if you think about this differently now with the rise of AI and how advanced it's getting, because I know my own work, it's I'm able to do more with less, but that just means I'm doing way more tasks. And you bring up the point of we're overloaded with tasks and more to do. And there's so much in our brains that that is pretty dangerous if you think about the burnout that's possible. Do you think about this a little differently now with just the rise of tech?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's taken what I've observed on kind of the digital transformation journey and put it on steroids. And to your point about your own experience, that it's not like you take half the day off now because of AI, right? You're just doing more stuff. And, there's a point at which that's good. So for instance, AI's ability to generate images, I was able to stand up a website for my new business, like pretty quickly, right? I didn't have AI design the website, but I had it make the pretty pictures. Cool. Awesome. Amazing. I think the issue is when we parachute AI into already overloaded corporate environments, like the entrepreneurial use case is a lot more exciting and clear. Once you throw it on top of a tech stack that's already Thomas Friedman, like hot, flat, and crowded, that's where it gets really messy. And also that's where, nobody's got, I forget the name of the book, but it's like the subtraction mindset or something like that. Like nobody's out there in corporate world subtracting, curating, prioritizing. It's just more. And again, we're like, well, it's what we do to make money, but it doesn't actually technology goes like this and human productivity tick, 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 very increases at a much slower rate. And it's because we organize work in crummy, silly ways. I mean, the original working title of this book was You Wouldn't Run a Machine This Way. Because, if humans were a machine, you're supposed to run a machine at a level less than 100% all the time because A, you may have spikes in demand where you need to go to 100 or above, but B, because you'd grind out its gears. But we're perfectly happy to do that to our human workforce. And then we're like, well, why is it not running properly? Why are these people so silly? Well, you made silly choices.
You cite research that shows 97% of office workers are frustrated, and that 42 to 43% of time spent with workplace tech is wasted. So with this research, if leaders are listening to these stats, like what are you supposed to do with this in knowing that time using tech is completely wasted?
Well, some of it is we need to just kind of listen to humans about their experience of technology. Back to that point about the kind of the everyday experience of work. When people complain about technology, we generally just brand them as whiners. And that emotional lens is unhelpful. What we need to do is somebody's like saying, okay, well, this system is driving me crazy. Just treat it as data, right? Just take a step back and say, that person just gave me data. What am I going to do with that data? And if you change your frame as a leader and say, okay, I got some data. All right, let me go have a conversation with my CIO or my CIO's leadership team or whoever my right interface, point is. From what I see, and I spend a lot of time in the CIO space, in addition to kind of like the HR people workforce space, the CIO would be thrilled to have that feedback. They actually want to do human-centric technology, but they don't get sitting where they're sitting. They're not getting the data because leaders are just like, oh, you're whining. Just be quiet. I mean, there's another stat in the book about when you implement a new system. Some research from, I believe, Gartner said that half of the people for whom you implemented the new system want the old system back.
Yeah, I believe it.
What a waste of money, So it's when you think about this stuff in terms of, investment and choices and all that, it's like you could really help the bottom line if you said, okay, well, half the stuff isn't working. Let's curate, let's have that engaged conversation with IT, because in my experience in 2025, IT is not the problem. They're just not getting the information they need to do their jobs the way that they would actually like to do them.
You talk about work intensification, and you said that fewer employees must do more work more frequently in less time. What's causing this movement?
Well, some of it is just with different turns of the economic cycle. You get natural points of intensification. So take that as just the secular change is, I think, again, it's a belief fostered by, in many ways, technology that we can just kind of pack more in. And we have this cultural myth about every company has to grow at X% forever. And the way that we grow is just by constant compression. I'm working on another book right now. And one of the things I talk about for work intensification is that it's like, imagine you were carrying a bag of sponges and then they replaced your sponges with bricks. That's work intensification. It takes up the same amount of space, basically, although probably they gave you more bricks too, but it's denser. So when you say, well, I think Bob can do 8 tasks per hour instead of 6, well, why did you think that? There's got to be an efficient frontier somewhere. And then you wonder why is Bob complaining about being more exhausted than Bob was historically? He's working the same number of hours. Well, when you do more things per hour, right? Your brain is registering it as I'm more tired, right? I just carried a bag of bricks instead of a bag of sponges.
You talk about the work anxiety monster in the book, and you said it boils down to two messages. People are lazy and people are slow. Where does that come from? And what's the strategy leaders could use to unwind those beliefs?
Yeah, it's interesting because I think it comes from just some of our fundamental wiring about human nature. Like if you look at from I think the 1950s or 60s, theory X and theory Y management, right? That, it's either people need to be told what to do and controlled and all of that, or, people can be left to their own devices and they'll do the right thing. And if you look at people's beliefs across our society, broadly speaking, there are two camps, right? And that's part of why we have a lot of polarization on a lot of topics. So the first thing you can do is just recognize that you're hearing that voice and then ask yourself for evidence. I mean, this is, I think, one of those great leadership mind hacks in general. What evidence leads me to hold the belief that I hold, right? So, I think, okay, my team isn't doing this fast enough. Okay, well, how do I know what fast enough is? How do I know what roadblocks they are not up against? How do I know who's doing what work on the team, right? And that constant evidence-based interrogation might get you to, a very different place or to realize that something else entirely is the problem. But as long as we have this nagging, anxious sound in our heads that like it should just all be faster and better and do it more, right? It's you're laughing because it's unhelpful, right?
It's so unhelpful,
right? Like no therapist would tell you to think that way,
right? And it's often like the stories that we tell ourselves from whatever's happened in the past is inform those beliefs or supports that belief, and it's so hard to just unwind it. But I love what you're saying.
We do it to ourselves too. I mean, that's the sad thing. I catch myself doing it to me. I'm like, Melissa, why didn't you get all those things done? I'm like, why am I asking me that? I'm an entrepreneur. I'm literally my own employee. Like, why am I doing this to me?
You have a section on boss baby customers and how they've conditioned to be somewhat helpless and totally in charge. Maybe explain like what you mean by this and how do we reset expectations about tanking, customer satisfaction or burning out our teams with letting customers kind of control everything.
Yeah. It's one of those things where like things have gone wrong from a completely well-intentioned place. Then we started talking about customer centricity, some, let's say, decades ago. And it was a really positive, constructive, like we were trying to treat our customers like human beings.
Absolutely.
Thumbs up for that. That's awesome. I think where it goes wrong, again, is not understanding kind of the natural boundaries of that, right? That do we need 24/7 customer service? Might there be some hours in there where actually nobody needs their customer service and somebody shouldn't be working? Or, an interesting example, I won't say the name of the company, but one company recently has been experimenting with delivering packages between 4 and 8 in the morning. And I found a forum where this was being discussed. It was a gun owners forum because they were concerned about accidentally shooting someone who pops up on their porch at 5 a.m. because they were groggy and there's not supposed to be anyone on your porch at 5 a.m. And it was the whole discussion was coming from a place of like super genuine human concern, right? Like I am not criticizing the people discussing this, but how scary is it to see that company's decision in that context? And that's where you say, okay, maybe we just deliver after 9 a.m. because we do not want our employees to be shot.
Right. That is a great example of where listening to your customer probably makes a lot of sense.
Absolutely. And not trying to guess. I think it was it came from a good place of, well, we guess that, people really want things overnight. There's a whole night there. Well, unfortunately, there's a really good reason why we, we don't turn up on people's porches at 5:30 a.m.
In the book, you give us a history lesson on the HR function. It's about 120 years old. And you said that not much has changed about the function since then. What does the data say about the HR department, the HR function, and perhaps why it hasn't changed as much as it probably should since the workforce has changed a lot?
I mean, some of it is that HR just doesn't have the levers of control over what it is allegedly managing in the way that other functions do, right? The marketing function controls the marketing budget. You can't just like go out there and make an ad. The finance function controls budgets. You can't just go, to a certain point, you can't just go out there and make some unauthorized huge expenditure. HR, you can just go hire somebody. in a lot of companies, there are not a ton of checks and controls, on the sort of the workforce. If you want to manage somebody poorly and drive away a great employee, that is completely within your rights as a leader. You can do that, but it's not. Do you see what I'm saying? Like HR doesn't really have its hands around the workforce because we're, it's still doing the stuff of 120 years ago, like payroll.
Compliance and all the, really the check the box sort of things, but it can be a strategic function. I just don't know a lot of leaders think of it that way.
Yeah, and honestly, some of it is the concrete wiring has to get better. If you've ever, I don't know if you've ever had a job in an organization where you're supposed to lead through influence, like don't take those jobs. Don't take those jobs. That's a bit of what's going on with HR is when you don't have control over some of the key things that touch human beings in an organization, like you're doomed to failure and then everyone beats up on you. It's very unfair to, I think, a huge community of people who go into HR for largely the right reasons, are very committed, are very mission driven, and are very burnt out at this point in history.
Yeah, people get into HR to change the world and support people. They love people, but they come to find out there's a lot of resistance against them, and then they get burned out as a result.
Yeah, or just friction. I mean, that's the interesting thing is that, again, it's not like people deliberately want to screw with their employees. So much of it is unintended and unintentional, and just nobody owns the problem. I often talk about workforces as a wicked problem, which, is a term from sociology of a sort of problem that is complex and often ownerless. Workforces are a wicked problem. Nobody owns the workforce problem. And HR gets blamed for it, but they are, maybe have 10% of the decision rights, maybe.
One of the things I should have mentioned when we started this podcast is your book has 90 strategies throughout the chapters, more than what we're going to cover on this podcast. But one of the strategies that you talk about is reinvesting HR on an organization's terms. What do you mean by that, and how could we execute on that?
Well, I think sometimes what goes wrong with kind of a standard HR transformation is that organizations try to do everything. And they're kind of going, what is leading practice? Leading practices, we have, this huge tech stack, and then we have, this agile pool, and blah, 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 blah. And there's all these kind of templates. And the reality is, what does your organization need? Right? It's like if you were, let's say you're a public company that's taken private, you would change the composition of investor relations accordingly because, you were once a public company, you needed X, and now you're a private company, you need Y. We don't do that with HR. We kind of say, well, this is the formula. I think it's worth a bit of kind of customization and saying, where do we really want to invest? And also, where have we kind of grown accidentally without investing? So like a classic problem is that you've got all these HR VPs and no investment in the role, no clarity around the role. And there are real, you've got, again, bright, capable people in those HR VP roles, but totally unempowered. So, taking a step back and saying, okay, well, do we need this many HR VPs, or do we need fewer and like some OD people? Or, maybe we really just do need HR, but take the step back and say, what does this organization need? And just being kind of honest about the fact that HR is in a limited resources game, and just really like put your money where your mouth is.
Yeah, that's good advice. One of the things I love about your book is that it's very data driven. It's very well researched. One stat, or I guess a couple stats that were really alarming, I would say, was that you said HR spends roughly 3 times more effort recruiting than managing current talent. So that's 20% versus a 6 to 7% in managing current talent. That's wild to me that we're spending so much time in bringing people in versus just keeping people and developing them. So what are some shifts that we could make internally to rebalance that more towards like retention?
I think one thing organizations can do is really target talent efficiency as a goal. So currently what happens is, every time some new business imperative comes up, there's like a rush to the market. You see it happening with AI talent right now, right? We're going to make $100 million hire, right? And that might make sense for a handful of companies. Yeah, guys, you go for it. Totally get it. But for your average company, there's a lot of great research that says that your greatest asset is the people you already employ. So it's like if we make talent efficiency a goal of we're going to, generally speaking, go to war with the army we have. and really be efficient about our outside hires as opposed to these just long lists of open recs, right? Who doesn't have a million open recs? Those open recs say something, right? You're seeing a gap and you're just reaching out to the market for it. And that's where the 3 times as much time in talent acquisition comes from. And it's because organizations often struggle to know their own talent. So part of the puzzle is have a system around knowing your talent that you can sensibly manage. And what I mean by that is I've seen a lot of organizations in the last few years set up these big, we have a skills ontology, and it's got 3,700 skills in it. And then they're like, we're struggling to manage the skills ontology. Well, oh yeah, of course you are. And it's not necessarily helpful either. So it's come up with, again, a simple business relevant way of knowing your people. And then, you can also do little reach outs. One of the coolest ones I ever saw was I was doing some work for a company that made ball bearings. And they wanted to do increased robotics in their ball bearing factories. And so instead of we're going to hire $10 million for robotics talent, they just put out a call to their employees. Anyone know anything about robotics? Turned out they had a whole cadre of folks who'd been building robots in their garages for decades, right? So they were able to source most of their robotics talent internally. And it was people who loved the ball bearings business, loved the Midwestern city they were in. You know what I mean? Were already fantastic employees, and they had those skills, and all they had to do was ask. And I think organizations don't, know their employees and ask their employees enough.
One of the parts I really resonated with in the book was you said that leaders are starting to develop a habit of speaking in humane terms, and it's largely due to organizations growing more complex, and we're using a lot of jargon, more technology driven, and so it's just becoming more and more disconnected from the human connection. What's the strategy for unwinding that behavior?
I think some of it is this is a really good opportunity for peer coaching, that practicing our shtick with each other. Talk to your peer leader and say, did that sound weird the way I just said that? Did that sound really cold? It's interesting. For the book I'm working on now, I just interviewed an emergency room physician. And she was saying she actually, when she was a young doctor, she shadowed other doctors telling people that their loved ones had passed away. Or died. She said, you can't say passed away. You have to say died because you have to be clear. And that's one of the things that she learned. But she learned it by just sitting around and listening to other people talk. And I think there's an opportunity for that. Just listen to each other, practice with each other, and not just kind of uncritically, and unfortunately, I think our whole society is in this habit right now. We just uncritically spew words into the ether. Take a minute, create some feedback loops and practice talking like human beings, but also then create the space for the emotional impact of that. So sometimes we speak in inhuman ways because it's really hard to talk about what we're doing. So, you have to lay people off. You don't say, I'm going to go cause, 10 people to lose their jobs and their livelihoods today. Say, well, I'm going to execute on the riff. So part of what needs to happen is if you want somebody to speak honestly and humanly about things, then they need to have somebody to go talk to about what they've just been through. And then that person generally also needs someone to go talk to. And then eventually, it'll hit somebody's spouse or somebody who's just okay, this is fine. And they don't take the baggage with them. But we've lost some human connection in the workplace. We've lost some of those reverberation points of, I used to have at a company I worked at years ago, I had the office that people would go into and cry. You need that person. But then I also needed somebody to talk to about the fact I had 3 crying people in my office today. I don't feel so hot. So there's a piece around just managing emotion too.
You mentioned this earlier that when we implement tech, a lot of people wish they could just go back to the old tech. And in the book, I pulled out this, you estimated 900 billion a year is wasted on tech that doesn't work for people. So if we were to step back as leaders and really look at making the right decision, the right tech for our organization, what is a decision-making framework we could use to really step back and make sure that we're implementing and investing in tech that truly is going to work for us and not have regrets down the road? Because I think, to your point earlier, it's really hard to unwind tech once you have it. I know this in myself, when I add tech to my tech stack, often I'm not removing it unless I'm switching products altogether. And I know organizations are bloated when it comes to tech.
Yeah, you end up with that junk drawer, right? Everything goes in and nothing ever comes out. It's funny. I really do think a lot of the principles of home organization, like in the book, I talk about Marie Kondo in your tech stack. People say, if you have kids, right, every time you bring a new toy in, one toy has to go out the door. So like one in, one out. Some simple principles like that. But also, I think getting end users involved earlier in the journey. And again, I don't think it's like IT is not the problem at this point in history. It's the ability of the business to mobilize voices and also to have the right optimism, skepticism balance. This is very live in the AI conversation right now. Like, oh, people are resisting AI. No, people are pushing back on some features that might be problematic. And actually, we would get to a better point with the technology if we could understand the objections. But to this extent that, again, it's another cultural myth. We have to be like pro all technology all the time and not listen to objections, not listen to skepticism. It's part of how we end up with a junk drawer is sometimes we buy junk.
You mentioned the I Love Lucy problem, and you say it's both possible and tempting to create technology that works faster than humans can. What would be like your top design rules for keeping tech at human speed, especially where like the algorithms, the tech is setting the pace that maybe we can't even keep up with?
Well, some of it is like just pay attention to basic kind of human research and neuroscience, right? So you've probably seen the visualization of what your brain looks like if you do too many back-to-back video calls, stuff like that, right? What is the length of the human attention span? How many numbers can people remember? Phone numbers in the United States are 7 digits long for a reason, because there's a lot of good science about more than 7 numbers in a row. You can't remember them. So, and in general, things like keeping numbers down, which tech doesn't do. I mean, I always use the example of if you and I, worked in a physical office together and we were going to have a meeting with 50 people. There's generally, unless you got an auditorium, at which point it's a town hall and it's not a meeting at all, there's generally not a meeting room that's going to accommodate 50 people. You're not going to fit 50 people in even like a boardroom setup, right? If it's going to get tight, you can fit 50 people on a Zoom call. Some of those reintroducing limitations and just paying attention to kind of human neuroscience and things like that, I think it's very helpful.
In the chapter about the intentional workforce, you note that even at the peak of the Great Resignation, which I remember pretty vividly, like people were mass exiting or whatever, the intent to leave sat at 28%, which is identical to historic norms, as you noted. But what you found, it was that it actually varied by groups, like demographic groups, like possibly based on discrimination. How could leaders use that data to act on findings of this nature versus like a lot of employers are freaking out about everybody's going to leave? What do we do?
Yeah, I think it's, first of all, the most interesting thing is to start from the point of view that all the time, around a third of your workforce might want to leave. When we start with that assumption, I think we're a little bit less weird. And then really dig in on, do you know who the people are that you want to keep? Because I think part of what's going on with some of those populations having much higher rates of intent to leave, if you showed that to the organizations they work for, they'd be like, no, this individual, like, we really want to keep those people, right? But you've sent the wrong signals. And that level of kind of intentionality and signaling, I mean, I think it's some of what's gone wrong, for instance, in a lot of the RTO back and forth. Is, we want creative, innovative people. We want them to sit in an open plan office 5 days a week. Well, good luck with all that, because your policy over here and what you say you want to retain over here are at odds. And so some of it is just being really clear on, I don't think most organizations are clear on what talent they want to retain. And that's why you see so many dances with different performance management structures. And so many, reinventions. Well, we went to a 7-point scale. We went to a 3-point scale. We went to, it's deck chairs on the Titanic. You just don't know how to measure human performance because you don't know what you're going for, and you can't ascribe what work was done by who, how. And that's why we get all these weird performance management gyrations. But then without that information, then you can't get to the sensible place of, okay, if some of these people are sitting in the 28%, the 44% that intend to leave, the 56% that intend to leave, how do I stop them from leaving if you don't even know who you want to keep?
You talk about the three hidden hippos of strategic talent pipelines, and those are immigration, migration, incarceration. You said that they lurk underwater, but handled well can save your organization. So what's like a practical playbook that leaders could use to treat these as strategic pipelines versus not?
Well, I think, first of all, remove hidden barriers to roles. So, for instance, shorten job descriptions. Most job descriptions are full of just like a lot of words. And there's great data about how certain populations, particularly, will just self select out because, oh, I don't have those 39 things. Don't list 39 things, list the 4 things that actually matter for the job, right? Or if you, for instance, do you need this job in a particular location, or is that just like what somebody wrote in a form? So just pulling barriers out definitionally will improve the quality of your candidate pool for any given role, because it's like, okay, well, that job, it could be in Tampa, or you're right, it could be in Wichita. Okay, you just added all the smart people in Wichita, things like that. So that's how I really think about those pieces. Similarly, if you make it very hard for people to navigate, different processes around immigration, or, if you don't hire formerly incarcerated, you're just erecting walls to smart people who want to work for your company.
I know. I can't tell you how many times I've heard like, oh, we have skills gap. There's no talent out there. Like, I think people are putting too many barriers in play and are closed off to the talent that might exist out there.
Yeah, 100%. And again, it's kind of like poignant to me, because it's like these people have great skills and they want to work for you, and you're out there saying you don't want them. And then, to your point, fretting about how, that open rec is set open for 18 months. It's sort of like change the mentality and change the world.
Your closing challenge in the book is to bring the aspirational and the achievable together, marry up economics and empathy, and swing for the fences with our bats squarely in our hands. So if a CEO asks for 3 moves on Monday morning to start doing just that, what strategies would be on your day 1 list?
I would say number 1, and this is so hard for organizations, it's so important, come to a reasonable definition of what productivity even is. A lot of times we look at activity-based productivity measures, and they stink. It's useless activity. It's wearing people out. It's burning people out. And it doesn't hit business results. So number 1, just a reasonable definition of productivity that actually connects the right human activities to your business outcomes. I think that's number 1. I think number 2, do some myth busting. I hear from people over and over, well, the business is what it is, and they call it work for a reason. Like, can we stop? Can we stop? Can we just stop with that dialogue? It's unhelpful. You can have both a constructive and pleasant experience for workers and make a ton of money. Why do we think those things can't happen together? Plenty of great case studies there, right? And the companies that have made their workers genuinely miserable, plenty of great failure stories that, it doesn't. So step 2 is just like bust some of those myths. And then, I think step 3 is, again, listen to that data from the people doing the work. I really like, there's an initiative at Google, I think maybe a year and a half ago, where they basically said to their employees, you tell us, how should we tighten things up, right? Like, they had efficiency goals. They could have just hired cost-cutting consultants and done all sorts of gnarly stuff. They actually went out and asked their workers. They said, what would make us operate better? Moves like that are great. And did it cost Google anything to do that? No, it really didn't. It got them good press. And I think it generated worker goodwill and probably some great ideas. So just a little bit more of that, treating the voice of everyday work as data and working with it as data. That would be my 3rd move.
Love it. Love it. Melissa, this has been a really fun discussion. When I close my interviews, I always like to just ask this one question. And what is maybe an idea, a person, or a book that's inspiring you right now?
So, my perpetual inspiration a lot of times comes from Bob Sutton's The No Asshole Rule.
Yeah.
More recently, he wrote a fantastic book on organizational friction that I also recommend. But the no asshole rule, for me, there's something foundational there about being nice is good business. And there are other folks out there like Jim Dietert, who's a UVA professor who works on the topic of civility as well. There's something about deep research on how treating each other like human beings is actually the way to make money. I'm here for it.
That's so good. Well, Melissa, this has been a really fun discussion. You said you're writing a new book. I know you can't probably share too much about that, but anything you want to point people to, highlight, floor is yours.
Yeah, well, I would say, please connect or follow me on LinkedIn, and I'll have more to share on the new book soon. But it's very much in a problem solving direction. So I am super excited to share more about it soon. So yeah, hit me up on LinkedIn to learn more.
My guest today has been Melissa Swift, the author of Work Here Now. Melissa, thanks for coming on.
Thank you. This has been a lot of fun.
Hey, thanks so much for tuning in for today's episode of Transform Your Workplace. The content on this show is strictly for general information and educational purposes only, so that you can go transform your workplace in a positive way. The views, thoughts, and opinions expressed on the show are the guest's own and don't represent the views, thoughts, and opinions of either Xenium HR, the sponsor of the show, or me, the host, Brandon Laws. Additionally, Xenium HR or myself, Brandon Laws, doesn't endorse any guest, their business, or any organization they represent, so discretion is advised. We encourage you to work with a trusted advisor to find a custom approach that fits your organization's needs. Thanks for tuning in to today's episode.